God created us to be beings of love and trust. We all start out that way, at least. But pretty soon the world teaches us a lesson I wish we all had the opportunity to unlearn. The world teaches us to fear, to be afraid of so many parts of life. And this makes sense because the world contains a lot of frightening things. When I was a kid, we did not have active shooter drills in school like my children do now. Then the massacre at Columbine happened my sophomore year of high school, and school shootings have been a terrifying element of American society ever since. And this fear is ever present in my mind when I drop my kids off at school, hovering right below the resurgent pandemic. Fear has a way of debilitating us, of shrinking us down and holding us hostage. Thinking about fear this week, I also had in my mind Jesus' words from the gospel lesson I just read. Those words started seeping into my consciousness. And I noticed that Jesus had sidled up right next to my fears and made them seem very small in comparison. We'll get back to Jesus in a minute. First, why is fear so debilitating? Fear has a way of unmaking us. When God created you and me, God made our default position one of loving and trusting. Think of the toddler who will go up to any stranger and say, "Hello," and then think of the frantic parent who grabs the child by the wrist and yanks him away. Years ago, I met a 2-year-old cousin of mine for the first time. He's 11 now. We went to the park, and within half an hour of meeting me, he was flinging himself into my arms from the top platform of the playground. God programmed us to love and trust, not to fear. So when fear takes hold, the fear overrides our initial programming. Love and trust move down the list of conditioned responses, and we are no longer the whole people that God intended for us to be. Fear motivates people to do all sorts of things, the kind of things that unmake us. Some lie to their parents about where they've been. Some never settle into mutual, meaningful relationships. Some cheat, some bully, some abuse drugs and alcohol. Some become easy prey for con artists and demagogues. Some go on shooting rampages through places that contain people that look, think, love, or worship differently than they do. Fear is so debilitating because fear keeps us from being the people God made us to be. Fear hollows out our identity as God's children. Fear replaces the loving and trusting identity with one that longs to isolate and control. When our identities are tied up in fear rather than in God, we lose who we are. We lose ourselves because there is nothing sustaining or life-giving about fear. When we are fearful, when we feel like we're being unmade, what is really happening is that we are losing our connection to our identity as those loving and trusting children of God. And it's at this loss of connection that the words of Jesus begin seeping into my mind. This is where we make the turn and place Jesus next to the fear and notice how small that fear seems in comparison. Jesus spends much of his time in the Gospel according to John telling people who he is. His identity is a subject that crops up every other chapter or so, and Jesus signals to us that he is talking about his identity with a special phrase. And I know I've said this a million times in sermons over the last 7.5 years, so you probably know what I'm going to say. Those two special words are, I am, right? I am. But these two simple words carry a lot of weight. By saying I am, Jesus essentially quotes God's words to Moses. At the burning bush, God gives Moses the mission to free the people of Israel from bondage in Egypt. Moses wants some evidence to let people know he really met God, and so he asks for God's name. Anybody remember what God says? I am who I am. A little enigmatic. But when Jesus borrows this phrase, he reveals to his listeners and to us his divine identity. Jesus uses these I am statements over a dozen times in the Gospel according to John, and 2 of them happen in the story that runs the length of chapter 6, a part of which we read this morning. I'll get to the first one at the very end of the sermon, but before that, let's talk about the one in our passage today. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And with these words, Jesus reveals a piece of his divine identity. And as followers of Jesus, our identities are wrapped up in his. When he discloses a piece of his identity, we discover a piece of ours. When Jesus says, I am the bread of life, he invites us to imagine what bread can tell us about God. Bread nourishes us, just as being in relationship with Jesus nourishes us. Bread, in the wider sense of food, sustains life, just as through Jesus, as the Word made flesh, all life has come into being. But this is no normal everyday metaphor. Jesus does not idly compare himself to bread. Jesus is the bread of life. Normal everyday food and drink will satisfy for a time, but eating the food of the bread of life brings us into relationship with Jesus, who is that bread. One of the Eucharistic prayers says this beautifully, praying that we may worthily receive the most precious body and blood of thy Son, Jesus Christ, and be made one body with him, that he may dwell in us and we in him. In the Eucharistic meal, which we will share in a few minutes, we take Jesus in, and the bread of life opens our eyes to the wonderful reality that Jesus' presence surrounds us and flows through us always. The venerable hymn known as St. Patrick's Breastplate describes this ever-present reality. You all know this in the choir. You know what I'm about to say. Those beautiful words, Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. When Jesus reveals that he is the bread of life, he invites us into the reality that his presence sustains us wherever we are and whatever has happened. This is part of his identity, and our identity finds a home in this sustenance. Whenever fear debilitates us, whenever fear threatens to unmake us, Jesus Christ is there sustaining us, nourishing us so that we can continue on our way, surrounding us with his steadfast presence. We were made not to fear, but to love and trust. And the more we rely on the sustaining presence of the bread of life, the less of a foothold we will give to fear. I told you that I would mention Jesus' other I am statement from an earlier part of this morning's story. The night before today's lesson, the disciples row across the sea in their boat. But a storm comes up and threatens to swamp them. And then they see Jesus coming toward them, walking on the water. And do you know what he says to them? He says, I am. Do not be afraid. Amen.